Hello. Today we're going to talk a little bit about consciousness. Um, so we all need to be a little bit conscious. So what we mean by consciousness in psychology is merely one's awareness of oneself and of one's surroundings. So to be conscious is to be aware of some internal and or external events, things going on inside you and without you, outside of you. Okay. And of course, consciousness, an important quality of it is that it's multidimensional. So many things slip in and out. Okay. There's some simultaneity of consciousness that we can be aware of more than one thing at a time. But mainly we are conscious or aware of about one thing at a time. We have a stream of consciousness where our attention goes to from one stimulus, either internal or external, to another. Okay, so consciousness is a linear thing, but it's multidimensional in the sense that stimulation and what we're conscious of can come through many modalities. But mainly we're conscious or aware of about one thing at a time. We go through what William James called a stream of consciousness. Another very important quality to remember is that consciousness is a personal construction. What do we mean by that? Well, your consciousness at any given moment is only really one possibility, okay, of what one's consciousness might be or what consciousness might be at that moment, okay? So our consciousness at any given moment is defined by evolution, okay, how our senses evolved and uh, um, the range of the electromagnetic spectrum, for example, that um, we are sensitive to in terms of both vision and hearing, what we're sensitive to and responsive to and can feel, be conscious of in terms of our other senses. Um, it might have been different if we had evolved in even a very slightly different way. Remember the example from when we are talking about a vision of dogs, how they have many more rods relative to cones. Remember that? So their experience of the world outside of them, okay, if we had the same visual apparatus as they do, our consciousness of color and light and dark would be somewhat different, right? So consciousness is a personal construction defined by, in part because we're human and we've evolved in a certain way, by our culture. Okay, our culture can direct the kinds of things that we're sensitive to, thinking about, perceived that we have perceived, and so on. Okay, and then of course there are those multi-layered processes of filtration. Right, we've seen in the course. Um, Selective attention. We've seen how perceptual set can serve as a filter, okay? Uh, so that some things we become conscious of in certain ways, other things not so much. When we move into memory, we'll talk about um, various layers of filtration going through sort of a sensory storage of stimulation into a short-term memory and then into a long-term memory that we can bring up at will, and that can define our consciousness. Um, but even at the sensory level, we know that there's layers of filtration. We have, light has to get to the retina. Uh, it has to move forward until it gets to the occipital lobes, cutting through the thalamus and back in. I'm sorry, cutting through the optic chiasma where we see the switch over. Um, and we know that what ends up getting making it to our visual cortex then gets relayed to various other parts of the brains where it's filtered further and perceptions are created. Okay, so uh, again, consciousness is very much a personal construction. We can also talk about alternate states of consciousness. Okay, so there are mental states other than ordinary waking consciousness that really are a form of consciousness, an altered form of consciousness. So, for example, sleep, dreaming, psychoactive drug use, okay, hypnosis, and things like that all alter our consciousness in various ways. Okay, there's a module that was not assigned for this course uh, for this particular semester that talks a lot about sleep, okay, and dreaming and how sleep, and you should read that at your leisure. It's very interesting, very kind of important to read. But um, consciousness, sleep is not a state of unconscious. It's really more of a state of an altered state of consciousness. Okay. Um, and you should, again, that's something you can read up on. But we know that sleep isn't an entirely um, unconscious, because we know, for example, that sleep studies have shown that when people are given a button to push um, when they are dreaming, so they fall asleep and they are asleep, they begin dreaming, and you can tell a person is dreaming by looking at their pattern of eye movements. Rapid eye movements signify dreaming. Um, that in fact people are more likely to push the button when they're in this rapid eye movement sleep than not. So people even are not unconscious; they're actually aware that they are dreaming. Okay, we know that we don't fall out of beds, for example, um, when we roll over, and that if we can sleep on a couch, very unusual relative if you're used to sleeping in a bed, but we don't fall off, okay, generally, okay, because at some level we have some awareness of our surroundings. It's altered, but it is nevertheless an altered state of consciousness. So here are some forms of consciousness, okay. Some forms of consciousness occur spontaneously, such as daydreaming, okay, feeling kind of drowsy. We're in that kind of never land state of drowsy sleepiness. Dreaming is an altered state of consciousness. Okay, um, we are conscious of something when we're dreaming. Some forms of consciousness are physiologically induced. Hallucinations, orgasms actually put us into a brief kind of different level of consciousness and sensitivity. Um, Starvation, and if we're deprived of food or oxygen, we may hallucinate in various kinds of ways that go into an altered state of consciousness. And then we can talk about psychologically induced forms of consciousness, sensory deprivation studies in which people are put in completely um, devoid surroundings of any kind of sensory exposure, visual. You're in a white kind of everything's white. There's no sound. Okay, there's nothing to touch. Okay, and that can induce a different form of consciousness. Hypnosis and meditation are also altered states of consciousness, and I encourage you to read about these. We won't talk about them at this point, but they are in modules 9 and 10, as is sleeping and dreaming, where there's a nice discussion of these topics. Okay. Uh, they aren't, you're not responsible for them, but they're very, very interesting reading, and they give you some information on what science knows about these states. Okay, so let's go back to the personal construction idea. Okay, um, well, remember selective attention, right? Okay, the effects of perceptual set, that what we expect to see, okay, or for example, what maybe previous experience or something we've just encountered has affected basically what we're conscious of in the moment. And as we move into another perceptual field, if you will, what we were thinking about or what was primed and activated in our consciousness in the previous moment may affect how we see the present moment. That's another way of describing a perceptual set, right? Um, we know that language places limits on what we can be conscious of. So recall the split brain. Remember the guy in the split brain guy in the video, where Dr. Gaziniga asks him, so what do you see? Well, I don't know. Okay, so his consciousness is affected by the fact that he couldn't talk about it. And of course, we're talking about a split brain individual. So the stimulus was presented to the left hemisphere. I'm sorry, to the left and the left visual field. It went to the right hemisphere, which doesn't really have the language capability. And because of his severed corpus callosum and the way the experiment is structured, that information doesn't, it's flashed on the screen, it goes to the right hemisphere, it doesn't get to the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere, of course, is the language hemisphere. Okay, that's where verbal processing takes place. So he couldn't tell you. His consciousness did not include a description of what he saw. Okay, but there was some level of consciousness that he saw something, and in fact, his left hand, controlled by the right part of the body, was actually able to draw it. Remember, so language will place limits on what we can be conscious of and how we can be conscious of something. Okay, so again, the personal construction nature of consciousness. Culture, our cultures and our cultural training in the cultural milieu in which we live, and the cultural learning that occurs, okay, the language that a culture uses. Uh, so, for example, Hopi Indians, okay, out there in the American Southwest, they have no past or future tenses in their language, okay. So their consciousness, in terms of being able to, in reflecting on their history and their past, or projecting into the future, is a little bit different than for those of us whose languages have a lot of, have the different the past and future tenses in addition to the various present tenses. Okay, so when they're asked, they might be asked questions about, what might you be doing in the future. It's a question that Hopi Indians answer a little bit differently. They're somewhat confused. They don't conceive of themselves in the future, so it's hard for them to project and to bring that into a conscious focus. Okay, Eastern mystics. Okay, so the Far East is where um, is where meditation began, right? and the mystical religions and practices of the East, Buddhism and the like. Okay, so what was meditation all about? What did Eastern mystics discover? Well, they were able to discover that techniques and methods, okay, which we call meditation, various forms of meditation, of getting the noisy, verbal, logical left brain to kind of to kind of stop it, to focus on a mantra, okay, to try to stop thinking, to not think, okay, to stop that noisiness that's going on. That's the essence of meditation. So that if you can get beyond what the left brain is kind of doing all the time, okay, if you can kind of like quiet it down, then your consciousness changes. Okay, you can become more focused on more right brain and sensations um, some call it spiritual, a sense of um, a consciousness that you don't experience when your consciousness is continuously being thwarted. I'm sorry, being flooded by the logic and the language and the self-talk and the thinking that's normally going on in the left brain, so to speak. Okay, this is what in nowadays we have mindfulness training. You know, where people are, um, you know, you try to affect people's consciousness by training them to focus um, on the specific task they're doing, okay, or on a specific part of their being at the moment, their body, the sensations they're feeling that we're not even normally aware of because we're not paying any attention to it, okay. So culture and the kinds of trainings that follow from first meditation, then mindfulness meditation, and things like that, all have to do with um, altering consciousness, okay, um, through um, refocusing, not from a verbal language perspective, but from trying to stop that and focus more attentively on things that we don't normally focus on. Different cultures do that differently, more or less, and hence we have different cultural kinds of norms for consciousness. Even consciousness of time is a personal construction. So, for example, consider research that has looked at how people perceive time through the kind of the pace of events that occur within time. So if we listen to a piece of music that has 40 events every minute, some sort of transition of key, some sort of transition of beat, some sort of change um, in the dominant instrument. So a piece of music with 40 such events per minute, okay, is actually experienced as taking less time than a piece of music that has 80 events per minute, that is undergoing lots of changes. So the same amount of time passes, okay, but people's experience of how much time passed um, will be um, uh, that a longer time having passed if there's a lot of things going on within that equivalent amount of time. Okay. So the consciousness of time is a personal construction, in this case dictated by the frequency with which we're experiencing stimulus change. Marijuana, okay, famous for its effects on time, okay. So cannabis consumption in a mild dose, okay, our experience of duration lengthens at the same amount of time, seems to be longer, okay, when we've had a mild dose of cannabis, okay, compared to a control that is not high, if you will, okay. A very strong dose of pot, okay, can lead to a sense of timelessness, okay, so that we experience that no time has gone by, or very little time has gone by. We're in a timeless situation, despite the fact that it is. So this is a psychoactive drug that affects our consciousness of time and the amount of time that is transpiring. Okay, so consciousness is funky, right? Levels of consciousness. Well, we can talk about, um, some people talk about what are called preconscious processes. Okay, so preconscious processes include memories, memories that we can access, we can get to, okay, we can focus on at any time. Okay, but they're not conscious unless we deliberately retrieve them or something triggers them or motivates us to look for them. Okay, so those are called preconscious processes, memories that we can get to if we want to. Okay, not conscious at the moment. Okay, not part of our consciousness, but can become our consciousness, dominate our consciousness when we retrieve them. This is we'll be talking about memory in this class within the next several weeks. Then there are subconscious processes. Subconscious processes are memories, stored information that can affect us, okay, without a direct conscious attention to them. So this is the idea that um, certain kinds of memories or information that is stored in our memory, okay, uh, can influence us without us really knowing it. Okay, so this was Freud's idea of repression. Okay, which has received kind of a mixed um, level of support over the years by psychological research. But the whole idea with repression is that um, some uh, some events, some things can be um, uh, in memory, but we can kind of block them for consciousness because they um, are kind of disturbing. Okay, they are disturbing, so we repress them. Okay, the Freudian idea was that yeah, we repress them, but they nevertheless, so we're not conscious of them, but they may direct and influence what we are conscious of. So there is probably, as we'll see later in the course, better evidence for the idea that we can repress things than there is for the idea that things that are repressed can have some continuing influence on us without our awareness. But that's a debate and a discussion for another time. The idea is that repression would represent a subconscious process. Something we've already seen is subliminal perception. Okay, and we're going to see that in just a moment again when we talk a little bit about priming. But subliminal perception is this pretty well established now idea that um, very that stimuli that we don't consciously perceive. Okay, because it's presented too quickly. Okay, for the most part. Is does not make it into our consciousness, but may activate emotions, okay, and maybe concepts, okay, that become conscious, that we do experience at a conscious level, but we don't know the source. Okay, the source was because of this subliminal presentation of a stimulus. Okay, this is all. A lot of this is wrapped up in the concept of priming and subliminal priming that, excuse me, we'll get to in a second, in just a little bit. Okay, but this discussion of well, let's see. I need to go back on this one. Whoop. There we go. Um, I'm hitting the wrong buttons here. So this discussion of levels of consciousness leads us to levels of control. Okay, what is sometimes referred to as conscious versus dissociated control. So here's a schematic where we take the idea of levels of awareness or levels of consciousness. Okay, remember, consciousness is really what we're aware of at any given moment. Okay, where we have a continuum from very controlled processes. Okay, so for things that require focus, maximum attention. So all of our consciousness is devoted, okay, and it's controlled in its devotion and analysis of the moment at hand. Okay, so studying for an exam, learning to drive a car. Okay, and then we go to automatic processes which require minimal attention. Okay, so walking to class while talking on a cell phone, listening to your boss while daydreaming. Okay, so you know, here we're in a situation where we're aware of these things, but they require minimal attention. Walking to class, we can do that and still talk on a cell phone, devote most of our controlled process to that, while the process of walking to class is kind of automatic. Okay, so there's a vague kind of awareness of that, but it's a kind of an automatic thing. We don't really have to be thinking about it to be doing it. Okay. In fact, one of the things that we know and that you've read about in Module 8 and in other parts of the textbook is this distinction between controlled and automatic processes, where we know that when we're the classic example is that we learn to drive a car, it requires very concerted, controlled processes. You're paying attention to every moment of what you're doing. Look at this poor guy. But once you learn to drive a car, right, it becomes much more automatic. Okay, you're not really thinking about driving while you're driving. Okay, you can be having a conversation with your passenger. Okay, you can be kind of thinking about what you got planned for the day. You can be listening to the radio and singing along, doing all kinds of things, and you really are, because the whole act of driving the car, okay, has become so automatic. So this gets us into the idea of divided consciousness. Okay, so at one level, a very minimal level, this automatic level, where we have consciousness of driving the car, but most of our consciousness, our primary, what we're really attentive to, and what's dominating our consciousness, are other things. Okay, so we've got a divided consciousness coming on. So tasks that get really, really well learned, okay, we sort of become automatic, and they don't dominate our consciousness. Okay, other things are dominating our consciousness, but nevertheless, there's some form of attention being paid. So the light changes suddenly, you stop. Okay, you haven't been paying much attention to driving, but boom, that light changes, you come to a stop. All of a sudden, that's got your attention. Without even thinking about it, you're driving your car to college, and you make to school. You make a turn where you're supposed to. Didn't give it much thought. It happened automatically. You got it routinized. Okay, so lots of things become very automatic. Okay, and we get into this ability of to do divided consciousness. Okay, but nevertheless, we're moving toward lower and lower levels of awareness. Automatic processes require a minimal amount of attention and awareness. Controlled processes require all of our awareness, all of our consciousness. Okay. Then we could go to subconscious. Okay. So here's where we could talk about subliminal perception. We could talk about sleeping and dreaming. And then we can talk about, as we've seen, the level of no awareness, biologically based, lowest level of awareness, so that you basically we're talking about states of consciousness where the person is completely unaware of the processes going on. Now, understanding consciousness, this controlled versus automatic, is really critical, okay, and important to understand. So, controlled processes, again, mental activities requiring focused attention, and automatic processes are mental activities requiring minimal attention. So, drawing from your textbook, okay, talks about the dual track mind, okay. So the controlled process is the conscious high track. Our minds take deliberate actions. We know we are doing something, okay. Problem solving, naming an object, defining a word, okay. Automatic processes is the low track. Our minds perform automatic action, often without being aware of them, or only maybe minimally aware, okay. Walking, acquiring phobias, okay. When we talk about learning in classical conditioning, how we can become conditioned to respond in certain ways, some ways in scared ways, that's what a phobia is, without really consciously in any way willing that to happen. It just does, okay. We get scared. Our attention, our consciousness is enveloped by a fear, okay, but we really aren't aware of that fear, okay. Processing sensory details, although we might be aware, we're not aware of the cause of the fear, okay, or we might just have a sensation, okay, a minimal kind of, or we might avoid something, in the case of a phobia, okay, without really even realizing that we are avoiding something, okay. So this is an automatic kind of process, okay. So an example in the book, borrowed from the sensation and perception topic, a kind of an extreme example, where we get to well, not extreme, but when we're talking about a very, very high level of awareness of what your consciousness is saying, and the deep automatic process behind what really happened in your mind, okay. So the high track says, I saw a bird, okay, and there's the bird, okay. Unconsciously, we, quote, see all of these things, okay, and all of these processes took place. Our depth perception kicked in, our form perception, motion, and all of that. Unconsciously, those processes were taking place, but we are, that is at the lowest level, a very, very low level of any kind of awareness, okay. Very automatic. Okay, now let's switch gears here, or shall we say we're going to focus on the automatic side of this automatic versus controlled, okay. We're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about, the automaticity of everyday life, okay. And here's the theme here. Much of our behavior, okay, our behavior in general is much more automatic than people intuitively think it is. I think we talked about this maybe in the first week or two of classes when the whole idea of we sometimes tell more than we can know. We seem to think that what drives our behavior is this kind of conscious decision making, problem solving, letting our retrieving our attitudes and our beliefs in order to uh, behave in certain ways that follow that. That is very deliberative and controlled. Okay, but as it turns out, and one of the themes earlier was that it's much more automatic than you might think. Okay, because consciousness. So we're going to get into some examples of that in just a second. Okay, let's review a couple of things here, though. Okay, before we do that. Um, Conscious attention mostly is focused on one thing at a time, as I said. So be that a little bit of quick and dirty review from earlier in this narration. Okay. Now this is related to the phenomenon of inattentional blindness. Okay, which is that if you're paying attention to one thing or one activity, one event going on out there, okay, other things can be going on, okay, and change can occur. Okay, it's also called change blindness. In the that you're not even that you're blind to, that you never see, that you never notice, that you would never be able to report because you're focused on one thing at a time. Okay. Now this is related to again, this is in the inattentional blindness. You need to read about that in your textbook. A very interesting, important concept that's getting a lot of attention nowadays. And as an illustration of this, watch the Monkey Business Illusion video that is posted in the video theater. Okay, the Monkey Business Illusion. But consciousness, as we've also seen, can also be divided, okay, though we are unaware of it, okay. So remember the low track and the high track, okay. So we're on the high track, we're paying attention in some conscious kind of deliberative, controlled way to something, but there may be automatic processing going on about something else. So that's the sense in which we can talk about divided conscious. It's what happens when we're driving a car, right? What we're consciously aware of, okay, is the conversation, is the music, and so on and so forth, okay? But in the side view mirror, so to speak, okay, there is this divided consciousness, this awareness at some level that you're driving and the things that are going into making your driving safe and effective. Okay. Now, as behavioral and mental processes become automatic, like after you learn to drive a car, we become less aware of them. They become less controlled. So, as I said, lots and lots of things become very, very automatic, less controlled, and again, we usually run on automatic while our mind wanders elsewhere. Okay, so let me give you some illustrations. So first, we could talk, and these are just some examples, about mimicry. Okay, mimicry is an interesting phenomenon. This refers to the idea that people have a tendency, probably got some important evolutionary significance, but in any event, people have a tendency to mimic what others are doing. Okay, so there's been lots of studies demonstrating this, and there's lots of intuitive, everyday world examples that you can actually rely on. So, for example, if you go overseas, okay, let's say, and you end up spending a year in the UK, okay, chances are very good that that your English is going to become tinted with a British accent. Okay, and vice versa if for Brits who spend time here, okay, in the States. Um, that's all about mimicry. Okay, we end up taking on those kinds of qualities. Okay, and we're not even aware that it's happening. But you come back to the States after a year, and people notice, boy, you you sound a little British there, just a little bit, but we can sense it. But there's also been studies. So, for example, let me just give you an example of an experiment, the kind of chameleon effect that we can see, this mimicry effect. So, um, basically, so you've got people having a conversation. Um, and one of the participants in the conversation is a real subject, naive subject, going to be in the study, participant. And the other person is a confederate of the experimenter who's basically programmed, trained to, in the conversation, enact various kinds of nonverbal body language kinds of behaviors. Okay, so um, the person might, in one condition, it might be the case that the person crosses his legs. Okay, they're sitting talking. Relatively often crosses and uncrosses his legs. Okay, and then you watch as time goes on what the participant does, and you'll see normally an increase in the degree to which the person crosses and uncrosses his legs. Okay, in another condition, the confederate might be might touch their cheek, maybe scratch it. Um, Several times. Okay, you can see an increase in that in participants who are in that kind of situation. Okay, who are observing. So they become over time to mimic the person that we're having a conversation with. Okay, so soon everybody's kind of sort of doing sort of the same thing more, or at least more frequently. Non-verbally, and in this case, in terms of their body language and body movements. Uh, that's also been found, for example, with the use of certain kinds of words in a conversation, um, the length of pauses, all kinds of things we see get mimicked. Okay, and you can see um, an element of mimicry. In the contagion effect, that certain kinds of behaviors become contagious. Okay, so there's sneezing going on a lot in a conversation, and the other person, all of a sudden you're sneezing more. Okay, or sighing or coughing or something to that effect. Okay, sneezing tends to be kind of contagious. Well, it's in part through a kind of a mimicry phenomenon. So that would be an automatic thing. So this is happening. You're being influenced, okay, by another person's nonverbal behavior, okay, and you're not even aware of it. Okay, it's an automatic kind of thing going on there. Okay. Um, now, then we can talk about stereotype activation and priming. Okay, so priming, we've seen priming, and this is an important concept to be studying. Okay, in the textbook and in the outlines and things like that. Priming is the idea that stimuli, whether that we might not even be aware of, okay, or that we might sort of be aware of, but in a different context than it might affect us. Okay, so stimuli can be out there. Okay, that kind of activate a concept. Okay, or activate a framework, or activate in our mind a perspective or a concept. Okay. Um, and then our subsequent behavior, okay, um, may or perceptions can be influenced, okay, by that um, um, by the concept that was activated or primed. Okay, we call it the priming effect. Okay, and often this can take the form of having our stereotypes activated. So let me give you a classic example. Um, a study done by John Barge, who at that time was at NYU. He's now at Yale, I think, still. Um, so Barge did a bunch of research on priming, on unconscious priming effects. Not presenting material subliminally, but presenting it in a disguised way. So consider this experiment. Um, so people are basically in the first part of the experiment, they the participants engage in a bunch of puzzles and tasks. Okay, and one of the tasks is to it's kind of a word search. Okay, and so they're given this big matrix of letters and they're asked to find words in them and then to circle the words. Okay. For the control group, they're just a random set of words with no connection really among them. Okay. For the experimental group, most of the words um, that they find, or a large number of them, are words that kind of connote the stereotype of elderliness. Okay, the elderly stereotype, our stereotype of old people. Okay, so one of the words might be slow. You know, what else do old people characterize? Fragile. Okay. Um, you know, I at the moment I have a hard time thinking of words, but you know what I'm talking about. Fragile, old, forgetful, stubborn, perhaps. Whatever you think about when you think about um, uh, people who are old. Okay, those are probably some of the less positive ones. There are also some positive ones, but their stereotype of elderliness, okay, was activated, and they really weren't even aware of this, okay, through the task, okay. And then afterward, people in other conditions are asked to um, go to another laboratory, okay, for the second part of the experiment, which is down a long hall, a straight corridor, okay, in another room, okay. And what the researchers did is they measured how the speed at which people got from one room to the next down this long hall. And interestingly, what they found was that those who were uh, primed with the elderliness stereotype, okay, actually walked slower. They took longer. Okay, they kind of took on a quality of the elderly by walking slow and deliberately. Okay, than people in the control group. Okay, and the argument that Barge and his colleagues gave was that this was a priming effect. Okay, that you activated this concept, and without your knowing it, okay, not being consciously aware of it, your behavior was influenced by it. You walked slower when that was done. So that's just one example of of how stereotype activation can occur. Okay, um, so taking other examples, when people have had their um, um, the stereotype of of hold on a sec. I got a little tongue tied there. People who have had the stereotype of African Americans, okay, activated, okay. So by presenting them with, in this case, it was done by subliminal presentations of words that connote the stereotype that Americans tend to have toward African Americans. Terms that would kind of evoke that stereotype. I don't know, ghetto, musical, um, both positive and negative aspects of the stereotype that activated um, one's conception, okay, one's prejudice or stereotype related to African Americans, okay, versus those for whom that wasn't primed, okay. Then people were asked to read um, um, basically case histories of juveniles, okay, who had basically transgressed or committed juvenile kinds of acts, okay. And those who had been primed with the black African American stereotype unconsciously, okay, um, were more likely to see the actions of the descriptions of kind of juvenile acts as criminal, okay, and more negatively if they had been primed with the black stereotype than if they had not been, okay, because part of the black stereotype, whether we like it or not, it and we of course we don't particularly like it, but it is part of the stereotype, is this kind of criminality aspect of it, okay, and if that's activated, then then you're more likely to see it in your judgments of future things. And the juveniles that were being evaluated, okay, they were race unspecified. They could have been white, black, Hispanic, or whatever. But the act that they committed was seen as more criminal if there had been this when there was this priming of the African American stereotype held by many in the U.S. Okay, finally we get to the idea of mindlessness. So priming, important concept, okay? Mindlessness, okay? Well, mindlessness is this whole idea that much of our action is so automatic, it's just absolutely mindless, okay? That we don't really consciously think about things when we make decisions all the time, okay? And maybe even most of the time. And one of the nicest examples of this, okay, um, is research done by Alan Langer, Langer, a famous social psychologist who's written a lot of and done a lot of research on this phenomenon of mindlessness. So Langer did this study, I think this was in the late 70s, in which basically it took place at a library, right? Okay. And so back at that time, okay, real important commodity in a library was a copy machine. You had to make copies of, articles and book chapters and things like that, and there was a lot of demand. So libraries would have a lot of copy machines around. In some cases, they still do. Okay, so here's a copy machine. Okay, and there's always a line to use it. Okay, so what Langer did was she had one of her accomplices, one of her assistants, go up to the person at the front of the line, okay, and ask the person, basically say, may I cut in line to use the copier? And of course, most people said, nah, I don't think so, really. I mean, you have to get back down the line, okay? So you got very little in the way of compliance with that request, okay? 10, 15% of people say, yeah, sure, go ahead. Okay. In another condition, okay, so very little compliance there, but then she sent up a Confederate to ask people at the front of the line. The question was, may I cut in line to use a copier? I'm really late for class and I've got to get this, I got to bring this to class with me and I'm not going to be on time if I have to wait in line. And you got a higher percentage of people helping there, okay? People are helpful. Yeah, sure. You got a situation, sure, go ahead. Okay, so maybe that might have jumped up to 50% or more of the people saying, okay, go ahead. So that was interesting, and that made a lot of sense, right? You gave a good valid reason. Okay. Third condition, Langer sends up the assistant, and the request goes this way. May I cut in line to use the copier because I need to make some copies? Now, what kind of compliance rate would you get there? Well, actually, in that condition, the compliance rate was much higher than when no reason was given. Or, I just said, may I use the copier? Okay, and almost as high as when they gave a very legitimate reason. Half the people, when a person said, may I cut in line because I need to make some copies? Okay, half the people said yes. Okay, even though there's no reason there. Okay, the thing that's going on here, maybe you guessed it, there's a magic word. Okay, may I cut in line because I need to make some copies? Well, what other reason would you have to cut in line other than to make copies? Okay, but the magic word is because. Okay, people aren't really listening. Okay, they do hear a catchword. Okay, which we automatically respond to because it implies a reason. Okay, so mindlessly, people said, okay, because you've activated this whole idea in people. They're running on automatic because just triggers a compliance response. Oh, go ahead. Okay, so there's no, it's an empty because, but there is the because, and it's a catchword that triggers this kind of automatic compliance response. Another kind of anecdotal example that Langer gave that I always kind of thought was cute was her observation and confirmed by the people that ran the outfit was that they had this kind of candle shop. Okay, they had a sign out that said candles. Okay, and so they got some business. It wasn't as great as they thought would have hoped. So they changed the sign and to say candles that burn. Okay, and their sales and visits went up significantly. Okay, well, that's kind of mindless because that's what candles do, they burn. Okay, but that the point here is that these candles do something. We're not responding to the fact that there's no logic there, that it's just a redundancy. Okay, we're responding to a sign that basically talks about not just candles, but candles that actually burn. Okay, we're not thinking ahead that wait a minute, all candles burn. Okay, but it triggers an automatic reaction that now we got a product with substance. Okay, and so people went in. Okay, so we run on automatic. And the argument, mainly made in social psychology, which we're going to talk about a lot more, is that much of our behavior, and we're running on automatic most of the time. We respond to cues, okay, that we've learned, okay, and it helps us be efficient in our processing of information, okay, and in our getting from one task and activity to the next in the course of a day. But we're very, very automatic. Okay, we're not consciously going through controlled processes at every step of the way of a day of life. We would be overwhelmed with cognitive overload, if you will, if we did so. Much of our behavior is automatic, hence the automaticity of everyday life. Now, I wanted to remind you that for an illustration of potential subtle priming, okay, a really interesting illustration, make sure that you watch the short video in the video theater titled Money and Priming. Okay, give some a nice set of examples having to do with what kind of priming capacity does money have, okay, in terms of associations we have with it and how those associations may carry through to other behaviors. Very interesting. So watch that. Think before you act. So finishing up here, in one study, students showed brain activity related to pushing a button before they were aware of their decision to push the button. So again, we got an automatic response, okay, before the conscious, deliberate, controlled process of the decision, okay. So this was fMRI, remember that? Methodology. You see brain activity going on related to making a button push even before people could consciously say that they had decided to push the button. Okay. Does this mean the decision is an illusion? Interesting point of discussion, right? Okay. The decision may come after the fact as a way of justifying it. Maybe the decision is just something that goes along. Whether is it a real decision or is it just the justification of the act? Okay, it's an interesting idea, but for our purpose, it goes to the possibility, the important possibility of preconscious kinds of awareness and preconscious kinds of behaviors that precede, okay, the conscious slow decision, okay, a process of making a decision. So it's an automatic kind of response that's quick and efficient. What experiment from the beginning of the semester does this remind you of? Well, you can go back to see Wilhelm Wundt's study, maybe a little bit different, but remember people reported, people were able to report when they were asked to make a decision of when the ball dropped by pushing a button. They did that faster than they were making a decision of when they were just asked, did you hear the ball drop? Okay, so they knew the ball had dropped before they heard it drop. Okay, and they were able to actually report that. Okay, anyways, go back to I think module 1 and the narration that goes with it to get more on that. So why have 2 tracks? Okay, benefits, not having to think about everything we do all at once. Right, you can hit or catch a ball without having to consciously calculate its trajectory. You can speak without having to think about the definition of each word. You can walk and chew gum and carry on a conversation at the same time. So that's going from the really low conscious, low level to the very higher level. But even when we get into the mid-level of automaticity, like we saw with mindlessness and priming, okay, we can see the benefit, this particular benefit. Okay, of course the costs. Okay, well sometimes going on automatic, okay, can lead you to the wrong ultimate or an inappropriate behavior, if you will. Okay, that might get you into some trouble. But this is a good lesson to learn about the 2-track mind and why we have it. And that is the end of the show. Okay, so goodbye for now.